behalf of the Arts House, family of Mother Thomas, and Ethos Books, I'd like to thank you for making time to come to this launch, Memoirs of the Migrant. There are amongst us, many of us, who are privileged to know the late Francis Thomas, who have been blessed by the interaction with him. And there are others, like myself, who are very young, too young to have known him personally, but who knew him through the book that he wrote, Memoirs of the Migrant. Regardless of whether we knew him personally or through a book, I would encourage every single one of us here today to look at this new edition of his book and to find out more about the man, because it is to me as a publisher, who has been publishing books for the last 15 years, this book has been one of the most emotive books in my life, because the spirit of the man, the late Francis Thomas, permeates the entire book and really inspired and encouraged me in what community is all about. And I will encourage you to read the book and be inspired by it as well. Right? Now, how uncommon a man he is, I will leave it to those who have known him to come up and share. And so I will leave Margaret to talk to you and to introduce the book to you. Thank you. Margaret?
Maybe the speakers would come up and sit here, so your seats are located for ignorance. Anne, Robert, Kat, Catherine, Sukian, Ping.
Last man. The last one. I'm the last one.
40 years ago, in 1972. It's been out of print for a long time. And in the last 15, 20 years, I tried several times, spoke to publishers about reprinting it, but nobody was keen, and I could understand why. But it began to seem a bit of a lost cause. And I was thinking in terms of publishing it myself, perhaps as an e-book. And then Robert Yo, who was an old boy and a former teacher at St. Andrews, encouraged me to talk to Gofang. Gofang, yeah. And when I spoke to him, I was surprised when he readily said yes, which is why we're here today. So thank you, Gofang and Waihan, his wife, for taking on this book, for agreeing with me that it's something that should get back into circulation. And thank you, Robert, for pushing me to do so. Why did I want to see Memoirs of a Migrant reissued, come back in print? It wasn't just a case of a daughter wanting to do right by the father, of course there's some element of that. As a Singaporean, I would like to see a much richer documentation of our history. More accounts of the lives led by people, a whole range of people, both extraordinary and ordinary. The Singapore we see around us today was built by many, many people, not just leaders who deserve the accolades. But a lot of us contributed to it. And I think we should be hearing and reading their stories, their realities, and their truths. Also, I think Memoirs of a Migrant does offer some lessons, and I would like to read a few lines from it just to illustrate this thing. One lesson is that it is okay to admit to having weaknesses, to having made mistakes. This my father does in excess in his book. One friend who read it recently said to me after, she read it in one go, and said to me after that, he's very honest about himself, isn't he? Brutally honest. I think it's something a lot of us might want to think about doing. Another lesson is the approach he took to people. And let me quote a few lines from the book. It is part of the interest of the world that people have everyone as equal. I just don't think in those terms at all. People are people. Sometimes troublesome, sometimes pathetic, nearly always kind. Trying to classify races as superior or inferior is a futile waste of time. One point that comes up again and again in memoirs is his frustration with bureaucracy, with structures and systems that reward conformity and stifle individuality and initiative and creativity. As a teacher and principal, my father was always much more concerned about the laggards, the misfits, the naughty boys, the rebels, the forgotten and the misunderstood, the underdogs. And he writes, and then he quote again, we must not, and in his book he emphasized not in capitals, we must not close our minds and hearts to the needs of those who do not neatly fit into the schemes of our changing society. The schemes change rapidly. What we reject today may be the keystone of the next thing we have to build, which is a point not always understood or accepted by St. Paul's policymakers, the people who used to sit here and who now occupy a more glorious chamber across the road. Singapore is changing even more rapidly today, and all the more we need those who question, who challenge the status quo and the sacred cows, and who have new ideas to offer. This second edition of Memoirs has additional material. We've just reproduced the original book in its entirety, nothing changed. We didn't try to update anything as it is. But we've included some more photographs and a selection of my father's other writings, speeches, some very short, some quite long. Most of this material was speeches and so on. They were written in the 1970s, but many of the points he made still hold true today. For example, in one speech, I think it was at an OBA dinner, he said this: we are moving into a depersonalized society where the individual loses value and is treated as a unit of cost. Our revolution must be to recognize the personal value of each individual, his right to be different, and to follow his own way of life. This will not be easy in the new Singapore, but it is vital for the future. He made the speech in 1974, it's 40 years ago. We are now in that future he was talking about, and we are still struggling to get away from being treated as a unit of cost. So finally, there is in this edition a section called Tributes to Francis Thomas. In 1978, about a year after he died, his old friend Devon Nair, who was then running the NTUC, wrote to St. Andrews alumni and various others, former political colleagues and so on, asking them for contributions to a book he was planning that he wanted to call Memorial to a Migrant. He got a handful of responses, but he was too busy to chase around for more material and to complete the project. And I was not yet a journalist and much too young in any case to attempt to complete what he started. He eventually passed the material to me, and that's been sitting in my files for, 40 years, 35 years. And I'm very glad that we're finally able to do justice to both Devon and my father by publishing these tributes. That's all I have to say. We've got various family members here, and on behalf of my family, thank you all very much for coming and for supporting this event. And I'll turn it over to the various speakers, all of whom knew my father in one capacity or another. And we worked with him on the Anglican Welfare Council Committee and was in the social service sector. Robert Yeo was an old boy and a teacher. Catherine Lim was a teacher. She was my teacher at St. Andrews School because I did my I must tell you this story. My father was principal in the 60s, and we lived in the Woodsville House, which is the principal's house. In those days, principals lived there. And I had done my O-levels at Methodist Girls' School, and I didn't want to go on to where most MGS girls go on to, which is ACS when I was born. grown. Yeah. Anyway, so I initially filled in, I think my first choice was Raffles or something like that. But sheer sloth got the better of me. Because I looked at this again before submitting it. Now, if I get to Raffles or wherever, I have to wake up at whatever time to get to school by 7. And if I put St Andrews first and I go to the school, I can roll out of bed 10 minutes before the bell and walk to school, which is what I did. And sloth got the better of me, and I ended up going to the school and follow this principal, which was a bit awkward at times, but I'm glad because it gave me a deeper sense of being a saint. So again, thank you all for coming, and Anne, we'll start off.
Where Margaret left off. I first met Margaret when I was invigilating at the university exam, and I had to look at everybody's eyes see. And I thought, oh, Frank Thomas's daughter. That was our first. I should remember that one. Well, St Andrew's School has really an interesting history, and had the extraordinary good luck of having one distinguished principal after another, because obviously Captain Adams had been a remarkable man, about whom I mainly remember that he said, if they want to fight, I'll introduce rugby, and if they still want to fight, we'll have some boxing. That was pretty, I think, unusual in those days. So Francis inherited this great tradition. And it's wonderful that we're having these memoirs. I see Lena has just come in. I can remember Lena telling me that there was a very limited market for memoirs. The trouble is that's a very keen market. Maybe a lot of people are not interested, but those who are interested are desperately interested. And I think it's marvelous that we're getting this new edition. I have to confess my personal contacts with Francis were very limited and relate only really to the Anglican counselling, schools counselling service, which was a really pioneering, nobody else was doing anything to do with schools counselling at that time. Well, I can't speak for the Catholic schools, maybe they did, but the first institutionalized counselling for schools was this Anglican schools counselling service. But it was, and already one knew about Francis Thomas because, from the social work world, he had another unique characteristic, was that, as those of you who are old enough to know, Singapore was very largely just a network of shanty towns and kampong. Even in the late 60s, 31% of households were living in a wooden house. And around St Andrews at Kotok Pasir, there was an enormous kampong, although actually kampongs, too good a word, they were only shanty towns, they weren't organized kampong. And Francis Thomas had his students going out and doing communities investigations and trying to provide some kind of service. I don't know all the details, but I know we were very impressed at the way the boys from St Andrews were encouraged to get down there and find out how people were living. The schools counselling service, the trouble was that quite soon other schools wanted this service as well, and so the title became not quite appropriate. And from the schools counselling service grew the schools counselling service, which is still at Medley and England, it's still there out as a multi-centred service. And the service was quite unique. And I think he was really pioneering something much bigger, because the Anglican side of it became Anglican welfare, which is now Anglican the other side of it became the secular counselling for all schools. And Singapore hasn't got that many secular voluntary NGOs. We've been lucky that the religions in Singapore, all kinds of, going right back to the Buddhist anti-opium societies, we've had all the religions providing services, but we don't have that many secular services. And out of Anglican welfare and out of Anglican schools counselling, then grew a much bigger organisation that's still flourishing today. Thank you, Margaret.
I'd like to speak about Francis Thomas as a person who personally empowered me. I relate, those of you who have read my memoirs for Roots, two incidents in which he made me feel that I was, what is the word? Somebody. I mean, I was a young teacher. I taught in St. Andrew's School from about 62 to about 66. And one day I went up to him because I had been very impatient teaching literature and romantic literature to my pre-U 1 and 2 students. And if you know a little bit of English history, romantic literature stopped with Keats. And I went up to Mr. Thomas and I said, Mr. Thomas, are we going to pretend that English literature stopped with Keats? Because no school, I think there was one other school, reference institution, offered to teach the modern paper. The modern paper would be writers of the 20th century. So I complained to him, I said, Mr. Thomas, we cannot remain stuck in the romantic period. I would like to do something about the literature curriculum in PU1 and PU2. He said, what would you like to do? I said, I would like to teach the modern writers. And he pulled out from his drawer a modern curriculum, and he looked at the list of people. He says, T.S. Eliot, selected poems. W.B. Yeats, selected poems. Robert Graves, Goodbye to All Them. James Joyce, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Are you sure you want to teach these people? I said, yes, Mr. Thomas, I'll try. I was a young, fresh graduate, and I thought I could conquer the world, at least as far as teaching T.S. Eliot. And James Joyce was concerned. And Thomas says, I'll think about it. And the next day he said, go ahead. And that was how the modern paper was introduced to St. Andrew's School. I'm very proud of it. I had a lot of problems teaching T.S. Eliot. But if you ask some of my students, some of whom may be here, they'll remember that I was a good teacher, reasonably good teacher of Joyce's novel, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And so I must thank Francis Thomas for giving me the chance to do something a little bit, well, for those times, a little bit extraordinary. The only other school that dared to teach it was Raffles Institution. I think they taught it for 2 straight years and they dropped it. Why? Because the results were bad. A familiar refrain in Singapore. And the other thing that which he empowered me was one day I read an article in a magazine called NYLTI. I don't quite remember what magazine it was. It was some anime magazine. And then I saw an article by Francis Thomas, and guess what? Francis Thomas had quoted Robert Lowe. I flipped. Well, I mean, my principal quoting my poems, you know how wonderful it felt to be quoted, and how wonderful to be quoted by your principal. Francis Thomas was that kind of person who empowers people. And I'm going to sort of end, I could go on talking about it for a long time already. But I'm going to end by quoting a letter he wrote to me. I've got here in front of me 6 letters he wrote to me. And I do hope in time we might be able to do a biography of it. Someone else might get about it and we could do these letters. And I'm going to read them to you because I think I am. Thanks. Let's see, it's dated. He wrote this to me 1967 when I was a student in London. Thanks. I'm going to read it. School news. TV Singapura have persuaded Raffles St Andrews to play a special match on Sunday next in the Padang to be televised live as part of a series of rugged society telecasts of rugby. I think no letter from one thing to another is complete without reference to rugby. The other 2 matches are an Australian EMU team on Saturday and combined services on Monday. We beat Raffles for the 1967 Rugby Championships at Jalan Besar, but they won a new cup, the Kiwi Cup, for scoring more points than we did on our 2 friendlies. And he goes on to say, this morning I came 6 strokes each to Balawan Singh, Tan Keng King, and Chua Keng Soon for beating up Chan Wan Singh and Man Kian in Moonstone Day yesterday. The best afraid caused someone to phone up for the police who sent a patrol car and brought the 2 beat-up victims to my house for the school to take action. And then he ends with a piece about Margaret, and Margaret's permission. My daughter Margaret is getting a brilliant result and will be lucky if she has a clear entry to preview class. Of the results announced so far, she has A2, B6, and B7. I hope we can sneak her into our preview arts lesson. She hates the idea of being under me as principal, which I take as a compliment. I could go on.
Slightly different account of how I got to Sunani.
I could go on about Francis Thomas, but I must end with something which I think is historically correct. I think it might be in this house at the time when the Lim Hop government was in trouble for a scandal related to his education minister. That when Francis Thomas crossed over, and I think Lim Hop lost his majority. And I think Sadiq Pandi referred to that event and said that Francis Thomas, the only honest man in the Labour Party, the Labour Front, the only honest man in the Labour Front Party. I leave you with that comment by Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here today. Can you hear me clearly? Yes. Yes. To be here today, to join in this wonderful celebration of the launch of Francis Thomas' book, and to meet up with old friends and colleagues from way back when. When Margaret first invited me to take part in this event, I was thrilled because this would give me the opportunity to pay public tribute to someone I've always held in the highest respect and regard, And now I'm going to tell you about an incident, which though small though it was, has been filed in my memory as one of the most, as I would say, one of the most significant and cherished experiences of my life. Now, more than 40 years ago, I was a young teacher in St. Andrews Secondary School when Mr. Thomas was principal. I had newly arrived from Malaysia. I had just given birth to my second baby. My first one was 1.5 years old. I was desperate for a job to help my poor struggling husband, and therefore was in the worst possible position to balance the needs, the demands of family and work. And to top it all, the 2 housemates I employed to take care of my babies and do the housework were hopelessly inept, always quarreling with each other and neglecting my children. Now, a typical day for me at St. Andrews would be something like this. During recess and sometimes in between lessons, I would rush to the common phone in the staff room to make a frantic call home to check to see whether my babies had been fed, had been washed, had been given their medicine. And each call would end with me shrieking exasperated instructions into the phone. I was such a mess. And one day I knew that I had come to the end of my tether. I went to Mr. Thomas' office and said tearfully I was resigning because I couldn't cope anymore. Now, I'll never forget the kind look he gave me and the words he said, calmly and reassuringly. He said, "Don't leave, we need you. Go and take as much leave as you need and then come back." Now, as it turned out, I took only 2 days, and it would be a while before I understood the full implications of that seeming benign act of a principal in the context of the regulations and the rules that govern schools in those days in a fairly rigid educational system. Now, if Mr. Thomas had abided by regulations, I probably would have to apply formally for leave and then wait for the processing of the application. I would have to come back at the appointed date and so on. As it turned out, he just dismissed all these requirements. It was an act of courageous initiative. Courageous because, goodness, if you were a principal, you couldn't give that kind of carte blanche to an officer who could very well abuse it. Now, but it was his spontaneous, his trusting generosity that made him dismiss all the administrative what-ifs and buts. All he saw was a staff member in distress, and all he wanted to do was to relieve that distress. Other things could come later. A small enough incident, but since then, it has come to embody for me what I consider the 3 most important attributes of the human condition: compassion, courage, and trust. Now, years later, when my first book of short stories came out, an interviewer commented that although my stories were often touched with a hard-edged sense of irony and even cynicism, they were always underlaid by passionate humanity. And I was almost tempted to tell the interviewer about that inspiring incident in my life so many years ago. And now I must tell you something different about a regret. Yes, a regret, because I really regretted that I had not made use of an opportunity to reciprocate that act. Not with compassion and kindness, because Mr. Thomas, in his position as principal, didn't need that, but with something like thoughtfulness and cheer, which I think he would have appreciated. Now let me explain. As an English language teacher, I often had the pleasure of coming across howlers, student mistakes in my students' compositions. Mistakes as a result of misspellings, wrong use of words, distortions, contortions of English syntax, and so on. I'm sure you're familiar with these mistakes, right? And if I had shared them with Mr. Thomas, who had a certain sense of humor, I think he would have been entertained. And now I'm going to entertain you by giving you examples of these student howlers. Not from my collection, but even better, from a compilation, a certain book published internationally. These are submissions by small children in their history test. The inhabitants of ancient Egypt were called mummies. They lived in the sailor dessert and traveled by Camelot. In the Olympic Games, Greeks ran races, jumped, hurled the biscuits, and threw the java. During the Renaissance, America began. Christopher Columbus was a great navigator who discovered America while cursing about the Atlantic. When Lincoln was president, he would only wear a tall silk hat. Queen Victoria was the longest queen and sat on a throne for 63 years. And the real gems for me came from the older students. Now here are two examples. I just love them and I've taken them down because they are gorgeous. Based on Miss Spellings. The first one based on Miss Spelling, the second one later. Now, the first one, written probably by a student of agriculture. And the sentence goes like this. The soil here is very fertile as it is full of microorganisms. Wonderfully spelled. And another one, this one, based on an equally delightful malapropism. Sir Francis Drake circumcised the world with a Now my examples are not really as spectacular, but I'll give you two examples that I've taken from the general paper essays of my students. I taught the general paper, and as you know, it was a compulsory paper. And being a very exam-conscious teacher, my God, I was exam-conscious. I would scrutinize past year exam papers to find out what were recurring areas that examiners would be interested in to test the students in. And I found one. Every year, without fail, the examiners would test the candidate's ability to write on various aspects of his own country. For example, what your government was doing to help the poor, the generation gap, how tradition was being affected by modernity, and so on. Now, I would encourage my students to concentrate on these topics and to choose them for the exams for two distinct advantages. I knew that if they write on familiar topics, they would write more confidently, and another bigger advantage, a psychological one. Their GP essays would contain information that was new and even novel to the examiner, who might never have been to Singapore or this part of the world. And just by being interested in your essay could make him well disposed towards giving the student a good grade. You see what a kiasu teacher I was. Now, I'm now going to give you two examples of the GP essays, both based on Miss Spellings. The first one. We can be proud of our nation, Singapore, because Singapore has become an affluent nation, spelled with an E. And then the second one, again, a misspelling. In order to raise the standards of living in Singapore, the PAP government must provide better, I think the student meant to write better public facilities, but left out the L in public, so that I found myself staring at this sentence. The PAP government must provide better public facilities. Now, so there you are. You see those of you who did not heed the calling to be teachers, see what you missed. Now, as I said, I really regretted that I did not share these howlers, these student bloopers with Mr. Thomas, because I think he would have liked them. But you know, in those days, I was a young, diffident teacher held back by all kinds of silly reservations, such as what would the other teachers think of me? Would they see me as currying favor with the principal? So there I was, held back by all this. And now, in conclusion, I will have to say this of Mr. Thomas. You know, Maggie, your dad could never, ever have been a hugely successful politician, wielding power and influence, basking in the perks and prestige of position, because his simple human goodness would have gone in the way. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Su Kiang, and as you heard Margie's introduction, I fall within the category of the rascally group that must make this panel complete. And I say this because I was a student in St. Andrews, right from Primary 1 to pre-university 2. And I had 3 eminent teachers on my right. So I had to be extra careful. Mrs. Lim Pependen was my English teacher. And when she was speaking, I was actually shivering whether she would have quoted my mistake. Unfortunately, she didn't spot any of those. Perhaps I did them pretty well. Now, I just want to share with you all that to many of you, Mr. Francis Thomas is known to be a social worker, man with compassion and heart. And he was the one who started the St. Andrews Social Work Group, which actually was community service based for students to take part in community service, to learn how to work with the community, to serve the community, even as a student, to be members of those groups and to partake in those activities. And on my part, I, in the upper levels, actually was a member of the social work group. And for the rascally group, academia was last thing on our mind. What we were hoping to do is always to have activities to justify our going back to school, not to study, but rather to take part in ECAs. And on my part, I was a case master, and the job of a case master was simply to be a kepo, go down to Potong Pasir, which was a village at the time, and try to interview families that were in need, that applied for help. And of course, we had every fortnightly on a Saturday morning to go back to school, and I had a key to the storeroom where the members of those families would come with a ration card, and I was very happy dishing out pounds those days, not catties even, a weighing machine poundation of rice, sugar, and even milk powder given out by the Catholic Welfare Society. And I enjoyed that tremendously because it meant that I didn't have to do schoolwork. And that was part and parcel of my learning also in St. Andrews. But aside from the opportunity of learning community service, which today I'm still serving, I'd like to share with you all an anecdote of my own. And I think I had a personal encounter with this giant of man, Francis Thomas. And I was only in secondary 1. You know, in St. Andrews, when you are from the primary school, you know that system building upstairs. After primary 6, you actually line up and then you run across to find your own classroom in secondary 1. And I found myself in an average class because I was a slow runner. Anyhow, at the end of the academic year, we received our results. And of course, looking at my results, we were all promoted, we all passed. But when I found out from my cohorts that the results that they had brought them to a better class, I was actually quite disturbed, aggrieved. And I was very unhappy that, why was I put in the worst class when my results were equal to some of those who had gone to better class. And this was towards the end of the year, maybe about 2 weeks or so before the school closed for the December holidays. But I plucked up my courage and without consultation with anybody, I just marched to the principal's office. And his was with doors open but with a swing door, like a cowboy saloon, those swing doors. And there I was, I knocked. I couldn't turn back. Nobody actually would like to face the principal because he was known to be quite strict disciplinarian. When I heard his voice, "Come in," I had no choice, so I marched in and I stood before him. And then I just looked at him and he looked up at me and he said, "Yes, what do you want?" Now I was inarticulate, there was an interpretation really. And I just looked at him and said, "Sir, not fair." He looked at me and he must have wondered, I think this rascal has got a problem. So he asked me, "What is it that is not fair?" And I told him, I said, "I just got my results and asked me, what class are you talking about? What year are you in? So I gave him, I said, from Sec 1. Then after verifying or asking me a few more questions of my unhappiness, he told me, you sit down, which is very unlike Senandus. You go before the principal, you stand, you don't get to sit. But because he had to leave the room, he asked me to sit right in front of him. Cane chair. And he disappeared for a few minutes. He came back with 4 scrolls, like spreadsheet. Then I realized that he actually had in his hands the results of the secondary 1 cohort, the A, B, and C class, and D class. And he spread it out and asked me, what is your name? Gladly I told him, my name is Natsuya. Then he asked me, which class are you from? And I gave him. And then he said, all right, what's your problem? Of course, when you accept one, I didn't have Mrs. Catherine there with me as my English teacher. So I told him, I said, sir, you know, you look at his name, I beat him. This one, I also beat him. I also beat this one. How come they go to that class and I go to this class? So that was how I spoke, you know. Blunt, but direct as a rascal. But Mr. Thomas had the patience to sit down and to try to digest what my true protest was all about. And he actually verified. And after a few examples, he looked at me and he said, well, why don't you go back and enjoy the December holidays? We're going to have a staff meeting in December and I'll let you know. So of course I gladly, picked myself up and then ran out of his office. Now, to me, it was something unusual because I didn't know what courage I had to just go. But to see the principal on my own was quite unthinkable those days. If you ask me to do it again, I probably wouldn't dare. But true to his word, I actually received a letter, a note from Senandus School in December. And he has got one line. It says, you are now transferred to another class. Now, to my mind, it was something very different. Here was a man who was the principal for school that has got more than 1,000 students. I was just an ordinary student, but because I had a genuine valid complaint, he listened to me, he verified what I had to say, and he took action after considering my complaint. And to me, I was elated. Truly, it changed me, it left an indelible mark on my mind that here's a man who listened, and whatever he might complain, great or small, to me was great. Although to many they didn't really care which class they went to, but I felt that it was not fair, it was unjust. And here was a man who listened and acted upon it. And I will tell you that it actually changed my life. Rascals don't only care for exams and schoolwork, but because the man believed in me, I felt that I couldn't let him down. And on my own, I begin to realize that there's more towards school life in Senandus than just being a rascally student, just play and fight, Frankly, the names that were mentioned earlier by Patrick were my cohort boys. So I'm very familiar with these boys whose names were mentioned. You may not have realized it, but I know them very well. We were part of the team, naughty group, that won't hesitate to use fists to settle disputes. But we learn. And I think what I gained really through all this is that in later years, professionally, I learned to listen. I learned to digest what others are saying before I act. And if it is right to do, I think I learned from that great man, the giant of the man. We must dare to act and believe in what is right. So I thought I would share this episode of my own, and this is representative of many instances of Senandus boys, some of whom are here, in their own experiences would have had this occasion to know and learn a lot of life truths, that we would apply in our later lives. So, ladies and gentlemen, even today, I am still very much involved in St. Andrews in one way or another. And I love the job in being able to work with the school and the principals so that we can impart that value that I have also learned, much of which was during the days of St. Andrews and under Francis Thomas. Thank you.
My name is Yi Tek Peng, and I came from a little village in Johor called Yong Peng. In Chinese, it means everlasting peace. In real life, it was a blank spot during the emergency. 1946, St. Andrews was the first school that reopened after the war. So me and my two brothers enrolled in St. Andrews. 1947, St. Andrews House was reopened, and the three of us enrolled in St. Andrews House. I remember on Sunday, the day before the school started, we assembled in front of the boarding house. And in the evening, the housemaster came out, introduced himself. And here he was, a tall Englishman, and said, "I am Francis Thomas." And he also introduced the matron, Mrs. Morel. And so we learned who they were. Now, Mr. Thomas is a very private person as far as I'm concerned. He treasures his privacy. And that was all we saw of him. He had a car, a Ford car, open-hooded. And in those days, we had to go down to cold storage and pick up our provision. And our happiest days were those boys who could tumpang, who could get a ride in the car and go all the way to cold storage and back. He doesn't eat with us. For 2 years, he never joined us in our meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I can understand that because he ate a different diet. And so, the butler, the matron, served him. Now, you would think, or you think, that a lady wins the heart of a man through his stomach. If you thought of that, then you are wrong. Because Francis Thomas saw the beauty of her in her heart. And he fell in love with her. And so the two became one in 1948. They were married. And they were married in St. Andrew's Cathedral. Can you imagine the joy of the boarding house boys? Hurrah! The housemaster married the matron. And we went down to Cathedral and we sat at the choir stalls right in front and sang our hearts out. I can't remember what the hymns were, but then we were really enjoying ourselves and we were very glad that they were married. And they had a tea reception in the school hall. After they were married, they moved to a house called Beckles House, which is next to the boarding house. Now, Beckles, I'll just elaborate a little bit. Beckles was the colonial chaplain at that time. And St. Andrews did not get any grant in aid from the government. And so Beccles asked for grant. And at the time, the inspector of schools, they did not use a high-sounding name like director and all the rest of it, said that, okay, we will give you grant on results of the students. Each student pass will be given 50 cents. And so that's how we became St. Andrew's School, Church of England Grant in Aid School. During their stay in Beccles' house, one day the matron, Mrs. Thomas, saw someone at the fence plucking leaves, digging something. And so she went up to the person and said, what do you do? What were you doing? The farmer said, we are getting some leaves to heal our wounds. And Mrs. Thomas invited the farmer in, washed the wound, dressed it, and then sent her home. Word got round that up the hill there's a lady who would dress and treat wounds. So many of them came. And then she could not cope up with it. And Francis Thomas invited volunteers from the school, and we formed St. Andrew's Clinic Club. And that's where we began our social work. The clinic was way inside the kampong, Potong Pasir, about 1 mile away. And I remember there's a temple and there's a wayang shed. And in the wayang shed, we attended the patients, our patients. Then it grew, and we could not continue in the wayang shed. In fact, during that time, we also got the help of St. Margaret's School. Some of the girls came to help us, I think more to our own excitement. Yeah, so we came, and the clinic was transferred to the school ground, and we had a room, and I remember G.G. Thompson officially opened the clinic. And then the government opened a public clinic at the Serangoon, Upper Serangoon Junction at Maya Pichitia. And so they took over the duty of looking after the patients. So St. Andrew's Clinic closed shop. But then we did not stop. And that's where Sukyang said just now, St. Andrew's Welfare Group. And so from clinic to welfare group. Now in 1954, December 1954, it rained and rained and rained. And what made it worse was that the water was coming down Kalang River. And at Kalang Basin, there was high tide. And so there was the clash. And so the water overflowed the banks. And the water, the flood went up to the roof of the attic roof of the people there. And the water came right up to our boxing ring. And so there was water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And there were 3 things I remember of the flood. Of course, there are all heroes down there. You know, Mrs. Thomas collected corn the church workers, the teachers, Mrs. Chalaya, Mrs. Chong Hok Hai, Mrs. Brett, Mrs. Holloway. Some of you who were students of St. Margaret's School will remember Mrs. Holloway, and they came. Well, Mr. Thomas was in charge of the general in charge, and then we had someone who looked after the physical side, carrying the refugees in. Now, there are three things which I remember very clearly. The first is that during the time, the Scouts of Orion Troop was supposed to go to camp, and it rained and rained and rained, so they cancelled the camp. But amongst the scouts was a young man, a young Indian boy called Shankar Kumar. He went down to Senate Estate and collected clothes and brought them to the refugee center. That was the first thing. The second thing I remember very well was on the second night, we held a Vesper, an evening service at the tunnel. And I remember very well the hymn they sang, which I later found out was the Seafarer's Hymn. It goes something like this: O God, our help in ages past. Some of you know it. Our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. I tell you, we were so thrilled. We were at the second level, and the voice floated up to where the refugees were sleeping. And I hope they listened to it. The third thing which I remember very well is that in the school there were 4 toilets, large toilets, 2 on the ground floor, 2 on the second level. And because the refugees camped at the second level toilets were heavily used. But these people were villagers, they were not used to modern sanitation. And so the whole place was filthy, real filthy and smelly. And you know who took charge of it? FT, Francis Thomas. He set the example. He wore his Wellington boots and cleaned up the place. And that was really great. Then, in 1960 something, 65, 1960, when we formed Malaysia, President Soekarno didn't like it, and so they had commandos try to disrupt the place. And 2 commandos came and set a time bomb at McDonald House, and they killed 2 persons. In St. Andrew's School, we had a tower, a 6-story tower called Lim Teck King Tower. That's another story. Lim Teck King's Tower. And at the top of the tower were the Allied forces. They used that as a communication center. So it is very likely that that place could be bombed as well. But before they thought of that, Francis Thomas had us held an evacuation drill. So all of us marched down the field, orderly and all that. 2 days after that, there was a phone call saying that there was a bomb in St. Andrew's School. And so we quickly, orderly marched 200, 300 meters away. after 2 hours, all clear, there was no bomb. It was a hoax. And I suspect that it could be one of our naughtiest students who made that call. And so he went back, hot, excited, and Francis Thomas declared half day. All of us were very happy. So that was one of our excitement. Let me see what else I have to say. Francis Thomas retired in 1974, and he continued teaching for another 2 years. Now, if you knew him at that time, he walked with a limp. His right foot, he limped, and it was found that he was suffering from cancer on the right pelvis bone. And so he was limping. And other than that, he was nicknamed, just go back a little bit, Hitler. Francis Thomas, we call him Hitler because of his mustache and all that. And his Chinese name, not found anywhere, but I remember Tung Wu Su. Tung Wu Su, Francis Thomas. Yeah. And he spent his last 2 years in the garden of number 1 Rosyth Road. He was very happy, and he spent the greater part of his time doing sculpture. He loved sculpturing and art. And the cancer was quite serious, and he passed away in 1977. 77? Yeah. Passed away in 1977. Now, FT, his short name, we lost a real great foreign talent. FT. And he was loved by everyone who knew him. He was a great chef. And that's how we missed him.
If there's anybody who would like to share, I think Mary, Pickwick's wife, Mary, who is another St. Andrew's store, has something to say.
Event, and it is the launch of the book Balik Kampung by Josephine Chia. I had the privilege of meeting Josephine some years ago when I offered to do a short seminar on writing autobiography, because I was in the process of writing my autobiography, and she showed up, and I recollected that I had read her book called From Under a Coconut Shell, which was her first book of autobiography, detailing her life growing up in Potong Pasir. And in particular, in that particular book, what was special was that she wrote with sadness, with compassion, with understanding about her mother, who empowered her, who insisted that she went to an English school. And Josephine Chia never looked back from that particular event of going to an English school. She also wrote about her mother, who descended, unfortunately, declined under the impact of Alzheimer's disease, and it was a very moving book. She has followed up upon that book with her latest book, and you see it in front of you. It's called Balik Kampung. And lots of things I want to say about Balik Kampung, but you know the phrase Balik Kampung in Malay means back to the village. And interestingly, those of you who might have gone to an earlier book launch that was to the right of this particular building, there was a book launch, a reprint of the memoirs of Francis Thomas, who was the principal of St. Andrew's School. And St. Andrew's School, as you know, is a school that is adjacent to Bojong Pasir, where Josephine Chia grew up. And as I was a former student of St. Andrew's School, and I taught there, I was able to make the connection between St. Andrew's School and Bojong Pasir. I think Josephine might probably in meeting later talk to you about that. But there are three things I want to say about this book, and I had the pleasure of writing the blurb. First, if you want to know what it is like to move in Singapore, to use the phrase from, I always think of him as the first Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, from third world to first world, then you absolutely got to be Josephine Chia's book. Because she talks about what it was like to come from a family that was desperately poor, but through the indomitable spirit of her mother, she was able to empower her children, Josephine amongst them, and to give her the English language, the ability to travel, the ability to write. That's point number one. That is part of her story. Point number two, she's talked about the fact that although the family grew up in poverty, the gotong royong spirit prevailed. I think gotong royong is a phrase, a Malay phrase, which can be loosely translated as the neighborly spirit, where everybody helped everybody else. And she had neighbors who were, of course, Chinese, Malays, Indians, and if they had houses, there were no fences, and everybody knew everybody else. And you can read about this in the book. And the third point is that amongst many stories, she's told some wonderfully moving stories. And the one that almost moved me to tears is about her very good friend Parvati, someone who was adolescent at the time when she became aware of the world, became aware of men, wanted to reach out to a wider world. But her father, a supremely conservative person, had other ideas, and tragedy ensued. Something happened to Parvati, and as I said when I read about Parvati, I think I'm right finally saying that you've turned it into a short story, right, Parvati?
Yes.
I was close to tears. I will not go on, but I will pass you on to Josephine, who will show you some pictures about the kampong. Read from the book, take questions, and of course, sign the book afterwards. So, enough of me, and over to Josephine Chia.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for giving up your time and coming here today. I really appreciate it. I also have to thank the National Arts Council, because without them, this book wouldn't have been written. They provided me the funding for this, and of course, the beautiful Arts House. It's their 9th birthday this week, I think. So that's why we have this celebration here. I'm so appreciative of this. And of course, my sister Magdalene and her husband who provide me a home while I'm writing this book. Otherwise, I might be under a tent. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Robert, for the introduction. Robert mentioned Balik Kampung. Balik Kampung is actually the first story in this series that precedes all the other stories that are in the different years, 1955 to 1965. And it was going to be the title of this book. And but at the Writers' Conference in November, someone had the title, so we decided that we would change the title. And in fact, it has worked out because the important thing that I wanted to stress in this book was about the kampong spirit, about how people lived together in those days. And when I put this book together, the important thing was, although it sounds as though it's a follow-up from Frog Under a Coconut Shell, Frog Under a Coconut Shell was more centered around my mother, her Alzheimer's, and how she gave me an education and the family. So that was more a family-oriented book. When I finished Frog Under a Coconut Shell, I realized that the story is not finished because there's so much in the village that I wanted to talk about, which hasn't been told. And mostly, I wanted to talk about the villagers who were living in the village. Of course, I am the viewpoint character, so I am there. But I try not to put too much of my own emotions in it, except in relation to my friend Parvati, who Robert has mentioned. And so the important thing about this this book is that it is the viewpoint of the common people about how they live their life and the changes that they see happen in Singapore, 1955 to 1965. So we look at the social situation or political situation, but it's not from the point of view of historians or academics, but from the point of view of the people. And I feel that this is important. This is what we feel. So that is the main crux of this situation that we have. The villagers kind of telling us their story, obviously using my voice. So just to give you an idea of what Potong Pasir means, I know all of you know the word kampong, that means a village, but there are people here who may not know that the kampong means village. And also to suggest that because potong means to cut and pasir is the sand, there may have been a hill in that area. Now, Robert was mentioning St. Andrew's School. One of the boundaries of Potong Pasir was the Kallang River, and St. Andrew's School was across the river. And then on top of Potong Pasir there's a hill, and where the colonial houses were located. So it is important to understand this because of the where the words might have come from. And in Chinese or Hokkien and Teochew it's called Swati, because Swa again sand, but there are also 3 fish ponds, and we were not sure whether the fish ponds were created because they were excavating land for different purposes. So that is the etymology of the word. Just show you what the village looked like in those days. And these are the atap houses, you can see that. And most of the houses we lived in were like that. And there were lots of vegetable farms in the Chinese sector of the area, although we live in the Malay sector. And we get, like fresh vegetables. You don't have to go to the supermarket. You can get your chai sim and your long beans and everything fresh. So that was really wonderful. A different way of life then. And this is the fish ponds. And I mentioned that every time we have to walk up on the dirt road out to Upper Serangoon Road, we have to pass the fish ponds. And I used to feel sorry when they were hauling up the fish in the nets and the eyes were all, wide open and their mouths were gaping because they can't breathe. So I can imagine that in those days where the village looks very rural. Most of Singapore was very rural at that time. We have to remember that. We have to remember the context of this book because it is during those periods. There were lots of kampongs in the old days, and the majority of people were uneducated. A Milo tin, but it's a modern Milo tin, but in the 1950s, this was something that changed my life. Because when I looked at this tin, I couldn't read any of these squiggles. And I was already 7 at that time. It was not a priority for girls to be educated. So what I would like to say is that for those who have the benefit of education, please make use of it. Because our priority was food, because that's the main thing, when the family is poor. Most families have lots of children. There was no birth control at that time. So my father didn't want to educate the girls. I was the elder girl, or the other girl that lived. We probably had a sister who passed on. So there was no possibility of an education. And when I looked at this Milo tin, I felt really stupid, ignorant. And it is looking at this, and I went to my mother and I said, I would like to be educated. And she said, well, that's not possible. We have no money. We have no money for food, let alone education. So, but I insisted, and then she said, well, if you really, really insist, I will do something about it. As you know, my mother, show my mother here, a beautiful Peranakan lady. She's changed my life, and I'm always indebted to her forever. And she's a good cook, like all Peranakan people. So she said, I'll make Nonya Kueh and cook nasi lemak, and you can go and sell them in the village if you want to go to school. So I said, yeah, sure. So I'll show you a hawker at the next. So this is a kind of hawker that you get in the old days. Walking around, we don't have the hawker centers that you have today. This is the sort of hawkers that you get in the old days. They go around the village with their baskets and selling all the food. So then my mother made the nasi lemak, and it was by hand, because in those days we don't have machine to scrape up the coconut and everything. So it's a laborious task to make it, and then she wrapped it up in a banana leaf, and then put it in a basket, and I had to go around, not quite large baskets like this, but basket, and I go around, nasi lemak, 10 sen, nasi lemak, 10 sen. There's 10 cents it cost in those days. Just to show you some of the kampong games that we used to play. And I think this is one of the, we have to remember that in the kampong we have no electricity, no running water, we don't have a tap in the house, and we have a well that will help us for water and bathing and showering and washing. And we have a standpipe which is on the cover of the book. There's a standpipe there, and that's the only drinking water that you get. That's quite a way, almost half a mile away from our house. So it's quite a challenge every day just to get drinking water. My big brothers will go and collect the water, and that's it. And we have a big tempayan, it's called a jar, where we put the drinking water. And we have to wait for rain to catch water to wash our clothes. So we have only one well, and we have a catfish in the well. Apparently the catfish is supposed to eat up the mosquitoes. Some of you are nodding your head, so you know this is true, right? The catfish is there to catch the mosquitoes. But unfortunately, during times of drought, this well gets dried out. So we have very little. So we have to try and catch rainwater when the rain comes, so that we can have water to wash our things. And because the house is hot, as you know, Singapore, and we have no electricity, that means there's no light at night. So in the night we have a carbide lamp, or a tiffin lamp, which is like a hurricane lamp where you have to pump. A gentleman there is showing you how they pump the lamp in the old days with some kerosene, and then it lights up and some gas or something, is it? It's a gas. So anyhow, we are always outdoors. So that means a lot of our kids will play all sorts of games outdoors. This is goli and marbles. We play with this kind of marbles or glass marbles, and we play chatte, hamtam bola, all the different kinds of games that we create. I think if you speak to people my age, you will hear lots of all these other games. And what that does is to create a community spirit within the village, because people talk to each other. We didn't worry about what color you are, what race you are, man, woman, child. We are friendly. And in the evenings, we will sit outdoors because A, there's no light in the house. Otherwise, you have carbide light or you have a hurricane light, so you don't sit in the house, you're outdoors. So people sing songs, we are chatting, telling stories, we recite pantun. So it's a kind of community thing. So this community spirit is what I try to engender in this book. And the word gotong royong actually means that communal kind of feeling, the communal feeling that people get when we get together and do simple things together. Just to show you, this is a wonderful, magnificent banyan trees, lots of them around in the old days. And the banyan are fig trees and they love water. So because Potong Pasir has a river, there are lots of banyan trees there. And if you want to trace, especially the young people today, if you want to trace where the old Singapore coastline is, look out for the banyan trees. You'll get them now in the middle of East Coast Road or something, and the sea is a mile out or half a mile out. The banyan trees will give you an indication that that was where the sea coastal line was. You see, in fact, I actually saw one just at Robinson Road, actually, which was a surprise. So you can imagine where the sea used to be. In our time, the old Esplanade was where the present cricket club is and just beyond. So now the coastline has changed tremendously. But if you notice, the banyan trees has got lots of vines and very thick roots, and they are great for games because we will swing on them like Tarzan and Jane, and all the kids who love the Malay legends like Hang Tuah and Hang Jebat, they will play on these trees and then pretend they are heroes. And the coconut leaf, we cut off the leaf and we take the spine and we fashion them into arrows and bows and arrows. So that is how we created our games. And these vines then, these thick vines, we cut them into small, about 1 inch length, and they become bullets. So you use your arrow, and the bullet goes. So that's how we have played games. And this was lots of grassland around Potong Pasir. And this was where some of the poor people get our food. When we can't afford to buy anything at all from the market and you just eat broken rice with soya sauce. Broken rice is the cheapest kind of rice that you have available at that time. And they were meant to feed the chickens. So on days when we can't afford any food, that's what we eat. And we will have just soya sauce on it. So then my mother will send me or my eldest brother into these grasslands where there are tall lalang to go and get some ubi kayu. I don't know if you know that wild ubi kayu grows in these grasslands, and then you can peranakan. I have lots of peranakans here. You know that we can make food and a good recipe out of anything. So we make the pucuk of the leaf into lemak with coconut milk, and then we use the root and we can make that into cakes and all sorts of stuff. So there are lots of things that we can find in the grassland. And also there are frogs. They call tree kueh in those days in Hokkien, and you can find those frogs in the wetlands because because of Kallang River. It's quite wet and damp, so you can find eels and you can find frogs, and we use them to cook, of course. Just to let you know, we were talking about I think in the book launch about Francis Thomas, who is the principal for St. Andrews, they were talking about the flood in 1954. Now, there are lots of flood in those days because when the Kallang River and the Kallang Basin in that time, when they get jammed up, the water overflows into Potong Pasir. But then we also have periods of drought. And you can imagine what it's like for the whole kampong. Firstly, the toilets are outside. We have a communal toilet, 2 toilets to share with the whole village. And then we also have only one of those tap there, the standpipe. So we run out of water. And if it's a hot season, like in our May or June, we run out of water and we can't use if there's no rain, we have to queue up. And we are very patient. We sit in there, and the government will send the municipal truck and give us the water. So I just want to mention that it is on this type of occasion, on that when in 1961, don't quote me the date, I can't remember my own numbers, but when Bukit Ho Swee caught fire, because firstly there was a drought, and secondly all the kampong houses are very close together, and because they were made of atap, just a simple lighted match will just set off the whole village. Bukit Ho Swee around the Johor Bahru area is one of the biggest kampong in Singapore, and it just went just like that because of one little match. And what I wanted to say in this book is that because the people who were there, I was there, we can remember it, we can smell it, and I wanted to show historical and social events in this book, but in a way that the ordinary person can identify with the book, rather than make it as an academic book. So you can imagine what it's like. What was it like in Bukit Ho Swee? It's a huge conflagration, and what happened was the fire actually hit a rubber factory, and we could smell the rubber. Anyone living around in that period will tell you about the smell of rubber, the dark smoke getting into the sky. So it was an important time in Singapore, and that was when, after the fire, that the government had the Singapore Improvement Trust, the SIT, before it became HDB. So it was an important part of Singapore's history and changing the landscape of Singapore. So you can see the houses are so packed close together, and this area is called the Lorong. That's where we would, this is Kampong Ubi in Singapore in 1962. Now that's not that long ago. You compare Singapore today to that kind of place. And this is where we, our kind of house is like that. And in fact, our house was actually the cow shed. It was a cow shed, and this Babu Singh was very good, and he decided to take it over and make it into 5 houses. And it was a cement floor, and with 5 atap houses like this, but he can't be bothered to change the gutter where the cows were urinating. So it was still there. And we used to play goalie in it, because we thought it's fun. So we run the marbles down, and because it's a terrace house, so from our house we can run the marble down to the other house, 5 doors away. So all the kids used to play like that. And of course, in the atap, there are centipedes and lizards and all kinds of things live in the atap. So sometimes when you're not very careful, it jumps down on you. My sister had visited, my pretty sister over there, had this lizard fell on her. I think she must have been 1 or 2, and I was only about 4 or 5. And she was leaping around with this lizard on her head, and I had to try and pluck the lizard off, and I was young myself, and I think, oh, it was terrible. And we used to be terrified of these things. It's like going to the jambans, the outhouses. When you go up there, there are cockroaches, there are rats and all that running around when you try to squat. I was so pleased the other day when I was swimming, and I saw a lady who was holding my book, and I had to go and chat to her. And she was visiting from Germany, actually. And she said, oh, and I said, do you mind if I talk to you? You've just made my dream come true. She said, why? I said, I've always wanted to see a stranger reading my book. And she was reading my book. It was so amazing. So she said, oh, I'm so pleased to meet you because I really love the book, and I'm going to take it back to Germany and tell everyone about it. And she said, the best part of the book that I love, she said, so it's when you are queuing up for the jamban, and because we don't have toilet paper, we only have squares of newspaper to use as toilet paper. But then when you are standing in the queue, you've really got the time before you go to the toilet, because when you get there are only 2 toilets, and you have to cross your legs because, it's not your turn yet. And then if it rains, your newspaper gets wet. So she said, I love it because when you run with water, you sprint everywhere. She said, I can just imagine it. So that was the time. And I remember when my first time I actually eventually got to school, I stole the toilet paper for my mother because it was so white and so soft and so clean, It was so marvelous. And my mother said I shouldn't steal, but, I thought it was a nice present for her. A roll of toilet paper from school. Just to let you know, there are lots of, I'm sure you've seen all these colonial houses around. And we had one, Atas Bukit, this is another sister who's in here today because she's working. But this is a big colonial house, and this hill doesn't look much of a hill here. But in the old days, before the present HDB, Potong Pasir HDB is now in this location, same location as the kampung, but they had to build it up. So they had to put the sewage and sanitation stuff and all that, and piping. So it looks as though the hill is now present day Potong Pasir. It doesn't look like a big hill, but in our time, it was quite a big hill for us. And we used to go up to the hill because they have, you can see lots of trees. They have rambutan trees, chiku trees, and then when we are in days when we're really hungry, we go up there to steal the fruits. You feel so guilty about stealing fruits when you're hungry. And so the English family lived up here, and this place is called Atas Bukit, which means on top of the hill. And at Atas Bukit, the English family had, lovely food from cold storage. Cold storage at that time was really for the Angmos, So we used to go up there because they would have a party, and the next day they would chuck out the food, and half of the food is still edible. So when we are hungry, we go through the dustbin and we pick up all the food. Like you can get an apple. Apple for us is very expensive. It was very expensive. We can't afford an apple. You have to go to cold storage to get an apple. Or they might throw out half a banana or a cake. Sometimes they have a cake and it's still wrapped in a wrapping and they chuck it out and we take it down to eat. So we weren't that proud at that time. So I just want to, and then some of the things that they threw out was Enid Blyton's storybooks because it's an English family. So I thought, well, I'll read, and then we didn't have books at that time, so we have the mobile library. They will come around with some of the books. And the Enid Blyton books were tattered and torn, and we would just read it. And the majority of the kids in the Potong Pasir were uneducated. So we would read it for them. And one of the things I did was started to, because Parvati, my friend who was 4 years older than me, works in a local paper factory. And in those days, envelopes were not much, there were not mechanization yet. So you had to fold the paper into envelopes. And she used to have her fingers all cut every day. The paper can slice your fingers, so she comes home with bleeding fingers, this poor girl, my best friend. And then, so one day she brought some paper, spare paper for me, and then I drew pictures and write a line, and then clip it all together and sell it as comics for 5 cents. But that includes reading to the kids, because they can't read. So that was my first earnings as a writer. So, we love Enid Blyton, and particularly this book, 5 Run Away, because Parvati always talked about running away. Because her father wanted to marry her off to a man who was 20 years older than herself. And at that time, the Women's Charter didn't come in yet into Singapore to protect women. So women, underage men can have, underage sex or this, or 10 wives or whatever. And there's no protection. It's only until I can't remember the date, 60, whatever, that the Women's Charter came in to protect it, and that protected Parvati for a while, because her father couldn't marry her off at 14. So that was a tragedy, and she always wanted to run away, so this book was one of her favorite books. So I'd like to read from that book, if I may. So, Parvati and I, and there's another girl called Fatima, we went up to the top of the hill to try and steal some food because we were hungry. And they had a party, the English people had a party, and there was a buffet table, and there was lots of food from cold storage, turkey and sausages and stuff, and we haven't eaten meat for quite a while. But then I was also trying to be clever. And this famous 5 series, there are 4 little children, and a dog. So they were called the Famous Five. And because I was reading the books to Fatima, when we saw these sausages and turkey and all that at the English people's house, they asked me a question, so I'll read that. Fatima was saying, "What are ham rolls?" Fatima asked when she heard that Julian, Dick, and Anne, the English children in the Famous Five story, ate ham rolls and drank ginger beer. She was a Muslim and proclaimed that she would never drink an alcoholic drink like ginger beer. And weren't Western children liberal to be drinking beer at their age? She, like Parvati, did not go to school. Of course, I hadn't a clue either, but I did not want to look stupid. "Some kind of meat," I said. Chicken is from ham, so beef is from cows. I guess ham must be from hamster's blood. "What is a hamster?" Fatima wanted to know. "Hey, yeah, a kind of animal lah," I said, exasperated, not wanting to show my lack of knowledge. "The kind of animal that lives in England lah. Don't ask me questions."
I think I'll end with that.
Josephine would be happy to take some comments.
I hope to help them with their writing and also introduce them to the culture and the history of Singapore. So I have other mentees. When I came back from England, I started to work with the ministry and then help them to nurture future writers and also hopefully give talks in National Book Development Council, National Arts Council, and also the National Library. I go around, give talks and tell people, because I feel that it's important. The history of Singapore is very important. You see, when sometimes people say to me, "Oh, you're so pro-PAP," I said, "Oh, okay, but let me remind you of the context that I'm pro-PAP. We had no water, we had no electricity, we had very little food." I'm talking about very little food at the time. Now, in 1959, I had the good luck to see the rally come in, the political rally come into Potong Pasir, and Lee Kuan Yew, I mentioned this in the book, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was there, and I can all remember it. Most of us who lived during that period can remember that young lawyer with all that gusto and courage and charisma. We can remember that man very, very clearly. And what did they promise us? Very simple things. Electricity. "We will take you out of your village houses," he said, "and we will give you electricity. Look at this, you come into this beautiful room with chandelier and all, you don't realize what it was like not to have electricity. You can't have a fan, Simple, definitely no iPad, definitely no iPhone, right? Water, a very basic thing in life, very basic. We are out of it most of the time because of the heat in Singapore. So what do? We get the well water which we can't drink, but we have to go to the standpipe for drinking water. And that's half a mile away just to get that. And my elder brother actually made a little job of it for the elderly. He charged 10 cents per kerosene tin. One kerosene tin, saw it off, and then he has two. He has a pole, he goes to the standpipe, he carries the water, he charges 10 cents per tin. So it was very difficult. So we considered that the PAP and Lee Kuan Yew and everybody else were our savior, because they saved us from that. Did you want to live like that forever? Definitely not. So when he come and he's on stage and he's telling you about this new Singapore, we were with him. We have to be. That was what he promised, and they delivered it. So in one of the other stories I mentioned, was our road was lots of potholes. No taxi wants to come from Upper Serangoon into Jalan Potong Pasir, because the taxi lands up in what is modern called sinkhole. It goes in, it never comes out of it. That was what Potong Pasir was like. And it was quite a distance. My school was in Cedar School. To get to school, sometimes I use a bullock cart. The bullock cart when he has his hay, or his worse still, when he carries his manure, and then he gives me a lift, and he's trying to perch at the end of the bullock cart so that you don't, get the manure on your uniform to get to school, which was what it was like. So what happened was immediately after we voted PAP in, what did they do? They sent us truckloads of sand, and they sent it to the village, so that sand and gravel, so that we can fill up the holes. So it became a gotong royong event. The whole community came out, and then all the kids and all the younger people would bring down the sand and the gravel, put it into the hole, and everybody dance on it, stamp on it, so that we stamp it into the hole. And the elderly people will go and make bubur kacang, cook epok-epok, and distribute to every one of us. I really remember that. It was the best gotong royong ever. And then the kacang putih man would go around selling his kacang putih. So it was like a party. But we were so appreciative because suddenly we didn't have potholes. We actually have a road in our village. And those were very meaningful things for us. I never saw a flush toilet until I eventually went to school. I was so excited by this thing that when you pull, the water comes out. Every few seconds I put up my hand. The teacher said, Josephine, do you have a problem? I said, yes. Because I wanted to go to the bathroom, because it's so nice. And when my friend took me there, she said to me, that's the toilet. I walked into the cubicle, I came out again. Where? She said, there. So I walked in there again, I looked, I came out. Where? She said, you idiot, there. I said, how can it be so clean? If you have seen it at the outhouses in Malaysia, Indonesia, or anywhere else, that was our outhouse. To see a clean ceramic bowl, was wonderful for me. I didn't realize, so I keep on going to the bathroom. And then you have this technique of trying to save your big job, only when you go to school. Because otherwise you have to go to the outhouse. So those are, it sounds weird now, but we were living in those times. So when the PAP came along and promised us better housing, HDB. Wow, HDB was like a magical place for us. A flat with electricity and running water was magic to us. And my mother used to live with her sisters, and she still had her clay stove in the corner of the HDB flat, because she then used the electric stove and a gas stove. For years, we had to try and wean her off from her clay stove. And that's all she cooked with, one clay stove. Everything was done by her. So when people say, you say PAP is a savior, look at them. I said, don't talk to me about that, because we know what it's like. We know what it was like to be deprived of these things. And to have these things given to us was that magical. Really magical. For us to be able to switch on a switch and light comes on. To be able to go to the bathroom, turn on the tap, and there's tap. Sometimes when I was living in England, sometimes I am sleeping and you know how it's like when you're sleeping, sometimes you get a nightmare, right? I wake up and think, oh my God, I'm back in Potong Pasir and there's no running water. So yes, I share, and it's a long answer to your question, but I try to share with the young people. And also to say that education is very important. I wouldn't be here today standing if my mother didn't cook, clean, wash clothes for other people just so that I can go to school. Not possible. So we had to work for every little thing that we had. I'm very proud of my heritage. Even when I was in England, I promoted the Peranakan culture. I can't say that it is the Singapore culture, but certainly I can say that it's an integrated culture, indigenous people who are indigenous to this country. So, but I do promoted it a lot when I was in UK. I still wear my sarung kebaya, a big challenge in winter, You got to go there in your fur coat and your boots and your tights and all that kind of thing, and give a talk, and then once you get there, you strip off all that and wear your kasut manik. This kasut that I'm wearing, is your toes will fall off, in winter in England. So, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, and I doubt if I'm the one to be able to answer it. But what I'm trying to do with this book is to generate a kind of community feeling again. I lived in a village in England, and I chose it on purpose, because in a village, there's lots of activities that people do together. that binds you as one whole. That I feel that although the HDBs were great for us, but in isolated in different sort of small cubicles, make it difficult for people to mix with each other. Plus, now people are very high-powered, we work long hours, and that becomes difficult as well, because you start to go home, there's your family, there's no time to have, more interaction with your neighbors. So I don't think I can answer that question really, but I would say that certainly I feel that looking into our culture, looking at why we're friendly to each other, being friends with each other, that's very important. When the Duchess and Prince William got married, what the little village did was just put up a big screen, and then they make some food, and all the villagers come together. Okay, people can watch it from the television set. But it was nice because we had a little hall, we had a big screen, and then we have some food, and all the villagers in my village got together, and we can chat. Look at her dress, look at him, how handsome he is. So that generates a feeling of community. And I think this is what we need to do here, to generate that feeling of community so that we can bind as one people, one nation, rather than disparate people. When you become too isolated, too self-absorbed, the I person comes in, I am just Chinese or just Indian or just Malay, it becomes separate. So this community feeling needs to come back in again. I feel that's important. It's a roundabout way to answer that question, but I hope that suffices.
I'm afraid we'll